Hello, today we're talking about cross-dressing in the theatre. I'm Gigi Gordon, the Comms and Creative Manager at New Normal, and this is the lovely Cheryl. Could you introduce yourself, please?
Hello there, everybody. First off, I am the trans consultant for A New Normal, because when you're working on behalf of minority groups, it always helps to involve somebody from that group in the work that you're doing. So thank you very much, New Normal, for asking me to participate there. I also do quite a bit of trans awareness training through an organisation called the Diversity Trust, which is great. We've been doing that for many years, training people from across all segments of society. But today, I think my main qualification is that I am a historian with an interest in the history of trans people. And I do a lot of talks for LGBT History Month. And we're going to talk a little bit about one of the talks I'm doing this year.
Yes, which is cross-dressing in the theatre, which is a subject that really intrigues me, and I actually knew very little about before you sort of mentioned it to me, Cheryl. Could you, I know it's hard because there's so much, but could you tell me a little bit about the history of cross-dressing in the theatre and how sort of that's relevant to what we're talking about today?
So I think the thing that people probably know about theatre, particularly in historical times, is that quite often women were forbidden from acting. If you look at ancient Greek theatre, for example, that was men only. If you look at Shakespearean theatre, that was men only. And there are other examples from around the world. So given that that happens, you've got a whole load of people performing female roles on the stage. And it's really interesting. It tells you a lot about how people viewed gender at the time. And there you can tell a fair amount about how the society constructed gender roles, how it felt about same-sex relationships, all that sort of stuff from the sort of theatre that they produced.
And what interests you most about the subject? I think there's, I mean, again, probably this is probably a bit of a tricky question because there's so much, but which part of it do you find the most interesting?
Um, let me give you a funny story.
Okay.
All right. So, well, hopefully it's a funny story anyway. It's what I'm going to use in my talk. So there were times in certain countries where theatre was actually all done by women. And one of the reasons for this is that being a performer was regarded as like being in sex work, that you were somebody who did performances for wealthy people and you were available in all sorts of ways. We see that, for example, in the Byzantine Empire, where the Empress Theodora first came to the attention of Emperor Justinian when she was an actress. And he was so enamored of her that he married her and made her empress. But she was an actress and a sex worker at the time. So we see that in various societies. And when Kabuki theatre first started in Japan, it was a women-only thing. So the women would be on stage and they would be performing male roles and female roles.
For anybody who doesn't know,
however,
what is Kabuki theatre?
Well, Kabuki is a particular type of theatre in Japan which is known for its cross-dressing roles. It would take me a long time to go into any more than that, but we'll get there. Okay. Right? It will become obvious by the end of the anecdote.
Okay.
So starting off, we have all women doing it, and it was I think apparently quite bawdy as well. But this was the time when of the samurai. Right, so we're talking 17th century Japan. Lots of lads going around having fights and all that sort of stuff. And you've got these women performing in the theatre. And what used to happen is at the end of the performance, the audience would get into a fight as to who would take the leading ladies off for the night. And it got so bad that the shogun decided in 1629 that he was going to ban women from the stage. From now on, theatre would just be men, and the roles of women would be played by young boys, which there's a Japanese term, wakashu, which not only meant it's young boys, but also young boys who were assumed to be sexually available to elder men, rather in the the manner of the pederastic relationships in ancient Greece.
Okay.
So you now had a situation somewhat like Shakespearean theatre, where all the female roles are being played by these young boys, but they are boys that the audience thinks are available for sex. And consequently, before long, there were riots in the audience over who would take the leading boys away for the night. And it got so bad that by 1652, the shogun banned boys from the stage. And he decreed that all women's roles would be played by adult men.
I sense
And
a pattern here.
this is where we get to the thing that's famous about Kabuki, because now we have people who can't rely on their youthful good looks to take female roles. You have to have men who are acting as women and who can portray women in a convincing manner. And that's where we get into this thing of Kabuki having particular actors called onagata who specialize in female roles and spend all of their lives studying women, learning to behave like women, and so on.
It would have probably been a bit easier to bring women back in, wouldn't it?
Well, maybe it would, yes. But, it was a fairly misogynistic society. So, it's...
Oh my goodness. So just to bring it back to sort of these islands, when were women able to sort of go back on the stage?
It was a restoration thing. So Charles II,
Okay.
having got rid of the Puritans, they were getting rid of all the things that were deemed to be moral laws. And one of those was allowing women onto the stage. So it became quite common in that time to see women coming in and women taking the roles that had originally been played by boys.
That's so interesting. I had no idea there was such sort of a history behind that. And I was reading something about how cross-dressing started on the stage and then sort of moved towards the streets. Is that correct, or was it maybe the other way around?
Well, that's that's part of my interest in it, is that you have all of these people who are playing female roles on the stage. And you have to ask yourself, what did that mean for them in their lives?
Mm-hmm.
And it's been happening for thousands of years. Way back in classical Greece, 100 BCE, there were men taking women's roles on stage, and it's been going on for all that time. Now, obviously, some of the people who were doing it simply did it as a job. And when the boys grew older, they moved on to more masculine roles. Instead of playing Juliet, you got to play Henry V instead. Hey, war stuff. Yeah, boy stuff. But there's always a question: did everybody do that, or were there some people who rather liked playing girls?
Mm.
Because if I'd been a kid in Elizabethan London, I would most definitely have been off down the globe saying, "Please, can I have a job? I want to play girls."
Mm-hmm.
It would have been a wonderful opportunity. So part of the research I've been doing is looking at what scholars of Shakespearean theatre and other theatre in Elizabethan and Jacobean times have discovered about the lives of the people who acted these roles, because we do know who some of them are, and some of it is quite interesting, shall we say. And then with the Kabuki, of course, these are people who are living their entire lives as women, at least in public. I mean, they might shed the role when they're in private, and we do know that some of them were probably married and had children. But when they were in public, they were expected to be in character at all times, because that was part of the job.
Did they face the same prejudice that trans people do today and sort of have historically, or was it seen as sort of a separate thing?
That's very difficult to say,
Yeah.
because if you don't know how. I mean, one of the things about trans history is that trans people's identities are always culturally contextual. Now, what I mean by that is that in order to be trans, you first have to understand what your culture means by being male and female. So there are some societies in the past where it was perfectly normal to say there is a third gender. Some of those societies still exist in various parts of the world. So if you were trans in that society, you would gravitate towards that third gender social role. There are others which have a strict divide that there must only be male or female, and in that case, if you're trans, you have to be seen to cross over, and all sorts of variations on that. So we can't really say whether a Shakespearean actor or a Kabuki actor thought they were trans without really understanding how gender worked in those societies. And that's very hard to get to because we don't have much in the way of people writing about it.
And I know that historically India has had a less binary approach to gender, and you know, as you were mentioning with the ancient Greeks, and here in the UK, has it been different in the past, or has it always been quite, you know, binary in the mainstream?
Well, you know, things have evolved here. Back in the Roman Empire, we know that there were trans women because there was an entire religious cult that relied upon trans women as part of their operation. So we could say that for definite. We don't know a huge amount about what happened in later centuries because there's a lot less written evidence. But by the time we get to like Tudor, Jacobean, and so on, we're starting to get a lot of evidence. We have records of people who did cross-dress. The most famous one from medieval times is somebody known as Eleanor Reichner, who worked as a barmaid and prostitute, sex worker, in London and Oxford, I think. But having been arrested for soliciting in the street, was discovered to also be somebody called John Reichner, and who apparently switched back and forth between these two identities. And had a bunch of female friends who were very happy to help with the cross-dressing and whatever. So you get that from medieval times. And then we get into like Tudor and Jacobean, where really interesting things are starting to happen with gender. To start with, the country has Elizabeth as queen. And this is like, wow, we've actually got a queen and she's popular. This is unheard of. I mean, obviously they'd had Mary, but everybody hated Mary for various reasons, apart from a few very devout Catholics. And we'd had Matilda, but Matilda had caused a massive civil war and it wasn't generally recognised as queen. And Lady Jane Grey as well, of course, who only managed to reign for a few days. But Elizabeth had a long and successful reign, and the country became prosperous under her, and this presumably had a rather negative effect on the self-confidence of British men, because previously they thought this was not a thing. But also the fashions. I mean, if you look at the fashions in Tudor England, they're really quite splendid. They're very peacocky looking men, which is, I mean, some of the sea captains, of course, look fabulously rakishly piratical, which, that's nice. But the courtiers tended to be a little bit more bling. And then you move into Jacobean times, and suddenly things start getting much more frilly. Right, the lace ruffs get bigger. They start wearing these long curly wigs. You look at somebody like Louis XIV in his portraits. He's wearing high heel shoes. It's got the stockings and the garters and the lace and the fur-lined cloak and the wig and probably makeup as well. So male power dressing in the 17th century was way different from us. And what that meant for their attitudes to gender is kind of complicated, but there was clearly something going on there.
That's so interesting. I've never thought about that before, that it is, yes, more by today's standard, more feminine dressing. And it's interesting to wonder if they thought of that as cross-dressing or not, or if they just thought of that as fashion.
Well, they certainly didn't, because they still had things called sumptuary laws. And sumptuary laws were laws about what you're allowed to wear. And they've been there since medieval times, and basically was keeping the poor people in their place and stuff like that. But it was also making strict rules about what clothing was allowed for men and what clothing was allowed for women. And James I at one point issued an edict. He's told his preachers in London to rail against women wearing mannish clothes in the streets because it was improper and immoral. Now, this is James I, famously gay king. So he's a bit of a cheek, really. But you know, this clearly he had a view on what was proper clothing for women, and people in London were not following the rules.
So would this be different if you were from sort of a higher class? Would they be allowed to wear, I assume, heels and wigs and things, whereas poorer people couldn't?
A lot of it was to do with the sorts of fabrics that you were allowed to wear, that
Oh,
you weren't allowed to pass yourself off as somebody of a higher social standing by wearing posh fabrics and things.
how interesting. And I think we're sort of getting a little bit towards this, but how would you say like historically cross dressing has influenced drag today? Because I feel like there's quite a connection between the two.
That's a really interesting question, because drag in many ways is a very different thing. Drag is a caricature of womanhood. If you think back to Shakespeare's times, a boy playing Juliet or Cleopatra is not being a caricature. He's required to play a convincing female role.
Mm-hmm.
Similarly with the Kabuki theatre, the whole point was to be convincing in the role. Drag, on the other hand, is absolutely not convincing. That's the whole point of it. And I think things like drag have always been with us. And we can go back to Shakespeare on this, because there are examples of drag-like roles. Falstaff in The Merry Wives of Windsor is dressed up as a woman at one point. And of course, this is Falstaff, the famously boozy, overweight knight, whom everybody laughs at. So obviously this is a comedy thing, and it's much more like a drag thing. And it would be than the people playing the actual female roles. So you've got two separate versions. You've got boys playing actual women, and then you've got men playing joke women. Drag, I think, has more in common with the latter than it does with the former. And that sort of thing has been with us through history. If you look back into like the 20th century, on the one hand, you've got pantomime, which is very much a drag-like performance of the pantomime games. But you also, particularly during the early 20th century, you had a lot of male impersonators and female impersonators. So they're also back in Victorian days with vaudeville as well. And these were people who went on stage, and their act was to be convincing as a person of a different gender. So you've got two very separate things there. And I'm not sure how much really overlap they have, other than that they're both cross-dressing.
So do you think the difference is the intent then? That's sort of what it sort of boils down to.
Yeah, there's definitely a difference in intent. But it doesn't necessarily totally work that way, because you look at ball culture in America, which is the African American tradition that they have, and I think there's more crossover between that.
That's really interesting to sort of hear the distinction between the two, because at first I thought, yeah, they were a little bit more similar than obviously they are. And another thing I wanted to ask you is, I recently watched Disclosure, which was an excellent documentary that you recommended to me on Netflix, about the history of the representation of trans people in cinema. And a sort of issue that came up on there was how cross-dressing in sort of with the intent for comedy, so things like Big Mama's House and Mrs. Doubtfire can carry a sort of anti-trans sentiment. And I was just wondering, with sort of our discussion and your your immense knowledge of the history of cross-dressing, do you see that?
Sure, yeah. I mean, there is a certain level of harm in there. The idea that somebody cross-dresses is a joke is potentially harmful to trans people. But as I said, we've also got this tradition of female impersonation, which, back when I was a kid, that was something that I might have aspired to, had I been prettier. But these things happen. I think that, in terms of harm, I mean, where it really harms trans people is where the joke is not, it's a man dressed as a woman, which is a joke that goes all the way back to May Day traditions in medieval England. We do it now at Halloween instead for some weird reason. So simply a man dressed as a woman isn't a joke, because everybody's that's a man dressed as a woman. But where the joke is specifically, this is a trans person, that's much more harmful. You see that in things like Ace Ventura, Pet Detective film. And most obvious example in the UK is Little Britain, where we were specifically being asked to laugh at trans people.
Mm-hmm.
And that is immensely harmful.
And I think that's the sort of discussion around comedy is often sort of quite a difficult subject for people, especially in our line of work, because you have, comedians like Ricky Gervais coming out and saying there should be no limits on comedy. The whole point is that it's something that's supposed to be sort of unbridled. What would you say to that sort of stance?
Punching down is easy, but not particularly funny. Punching up is much more difficult. And if Ricky Gervais wants to do comedy on easy mode, well, that's down to him. But maybe Eddie Izzard does better comedy.
I completely agree. I think I remember seeing sort of classic Facebook posts about, kids these days don't find anything funny. It's like we do. We just don't find these really terrible, just really ignorant jokes funny. We like jokes that have a bit of wit to them and have had a bit of thought put into them. But thank you so much, Cheryl, for your time and for enlightening people on cross-dressing in the theatre. Could you tell us about where we can listen to your full talk?
Okay, well, the talk is going to be done through the Shed Museum in Bristol. We've got a whole series of LGBT History Month talks, so not just mine. We've got a talk from a gay person from China, which is going to be great. We've got a talk about a cross-dressing sailor, somebody who was assigned female at birth but went to sea as a boy. And there's this fascinating talk about the people who founded the American Museum in Bath, which I'm really looking forward to as well. But my talk will be in amongst that, and we'll provide a link with this to allow people to find it and book in. It's free.
Thank you so much, Cheryl, for your time and all of your insights. And thank you to everybody who's listening.
No, pleasure. Thank you, Gigi.
Thank you.